A rich man got his black assistant pregnant, only to then fire and abandon her. 24 years later, a man enters his office. Who is he? And what does he want from Richard? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Richard adjusted his silk tie as he strode through the hotel lobby. He glanced at his watch, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. Right on time, as always. The elevator whisked him up to the top floor. As the doors slid open, Richard's eyes scanned the hallway. Empty. Perfect. He made his way to room 1507, his heart quickening with each step. 3 soft knocks, then silence. The door opened, revealing Vanessa. Her dark hair fell in waves around her shoulders, framing her face. She wore a simple black dress that hugged her curves. "You came," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard's smile widened. "Of course I did. I wouldn't miss this for the world." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. Vanessa's eyes darted to the floor, then back to Richard's face. "I wasn't sure. After last time." In his hands. "Hey, don't think about that. We're here now, aren't we?" His thumb brushed her cheek, and she leaned into his touch. "You're right," Vanessa said, forcing a smile. But doubt still lingered in her eyes. "It's just, sometimes I wonder where this is going, Richard. We've been meeting like this for months, and Richard silenced her with a kiss. It was gentle at first, then grew more passionate. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless. "Vanessa," Richard said, his voice low and husky. "What we have is special. You know that, right?" She nodded, but her brow furrowed. "I do, but what?" Richard led her to the plush sofa by the window. They sat down, his arm draped around her shoulders. Vanessa took a deep breath. "I care about you, Richard. A lot. And sometimes I can't help but wonder why we always have to meet in secret like this. Why can't we go out in public? Have dinner at a nice restaurant or take a walk in the park?" Richard's jaw tightened for a moment, but he quickly relaxed. He turned to face Vanessa, taking her hands in his. "Sweetheart, you know how it is. The press would have a field day if they saw us together. A wealthy businessman and his beautiful assistant, they'd twist it into something ugly." Vanessa's shoulders slumped. I know, it's just hard sometimes." Richard lifted her chin with his finger. "Hey, look at me. What we have is real. These moments we share, they're ours, no one else's. Isn't that worth protecting?" Vanessa gazed into his eyes, searching for reassurance. "You're right," she said softly. "I'm sorry for doubting." "Don't apologize," Richard said. He pulled her close, and she rested her head on his chest. "I understand. But trust me, everything will work out. We just need to be patient." They sat like that for a while, wrapped in each other's arms. In that moment, Vanessa felt safe, cherished. The doubts that had plagued her earlier began to fade away. As the clock on the nightstand ticked closer to midnight, Richard stirred. "I should go," he said, his voice tinged with regret. Vanessa's grip on his shirt tightened. "Do you have to?" Richard chuckled, planting a kiss on the top of her head. "You know I do. Early meeting tomorrow." Richard cupped Vanessa's face once more, his thumbs caressing her cheeks. "Remember what I said. What we have is special. Don't ever doubt that." Vanessa nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "I won't. I promise." "Until next time," Richard whispered, his forehead resting against hers. "Until next time," Vanessa echoed. With one last lingering look, Richard turned and walked out the door. The soft click of the latch echoed in the suddenly quiet room. Vanessa stood there for a moment, her fingers touching her lips where Richard's had been just seconds ago. Her heart felt full, yet there was still a tiny seed of doubt buried deep inside. But she pushed it away, focusing instead on the warmth of Richard's words, the tenderness of his touch. She had no idea that at that very moment, Richard was stepping into a cab, heading home to his wife. This went on for a few months, with Vanessa having no clue about Richard's wife. One night, Vanessa was hit with some shocking news, soon after which, she headed to Richard's office to tell him. Vanessa's hands shook as she stepped off the elevator onto the top floor of Richard's office building. The hallway stretched before her, dimly lit and empty. Everyone else had gone home hours ago. Her footsteps echoed in the silence as she made her way to Richard's office. She paused at his door, taking a deep breath to steady herself. This wasn't how she had imagined sharing such big news. Vanessa knocked softly, then pushed the door open. Richard looked up from his desk, a smile spreading across his face. "Vanessa," he said warmly. "What a lovely surprise. I wasn't expecting you tonight." She tried to smile back, but it felt more like a grimace. "Hi, Richard. I need to talk to you about something." Richard's brow furrowed slightly, but he gestured for her to sit. "Of course. Is everything all right?" Vanessa perched on the edge of the chair across from him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I'm not sure how to say this," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard leaned forward, concern etched on his face. "Vanessa, whatever it is, you can tell me. We're in this together, remember?" His words, meant to comfort, only made Vanessa's heart ache more. She took a deep breath and forced herself to meet his eyes. "Richard, I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air between them. Richard's face went blank, his eyes widening in shock. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Richard cleared his throat. "Pregnant?" he repeated, his voice oddly flat. Are you sure?" Vanessa nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I've taken 3 tests, and I saw a doctor last week to confirm it." Richard sat back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. His expression had turned cold, almost distant. "I see," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Well, I suppose congratulations are in order." His words should have brought relief, but instead they sent a chill down Vanessa's spine. Something was wrong. This wasn't the reaction she had hoped for or feared. It was as if Richard had suddenly become a stranger. "Richard," she said hesitantly, Are you okay?" He nodded stiffly, not quite meeting her eyes. "Of course. It's just unexpected news. I need some time to process it." Vanessa felt fear begin to creep in, wrapping its icy tendrils around her heart. This wasn't the man she thought she knew, the one who had held her close and promised her the world. The Richard sitting across from her now seemed cold, distant, almost calculating. I know we never really talked about the future, but I hoped." Vanessa trailed off, unsure how to continue. Richard's jaw tightened. "Vanessa, this is a lot to take in. We need to think about this carefully. Consider all our options." "Options?" Vanessa repeated, her voice small. "What do you mean?" Richard stood up abruptly, walking to the window. He stared out at the city lights, his back to Vanessa. "It's late. We shouldn't make any hasty decisions. Why don't you go home and rest? We can talk more about this later." Vanessa felt as if the floor had dropped out from beneath her. She stood on shaky legs, fighting back tears. "Richard, please. I need to know what you're thinking. Are you happy about this?" He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Like I said, it's unexpected. We both need time to think. Go home, Vanessa. We'll figure this out." Vanessa stood there, her heart pounding, tears threatening to spill over. She couldn't just leave like this, not without answers. "Richard, please," she pleaded. "I need to know the truth. What's really going on?" Richard's shoulders slumped and he turned to face her, his expression a mix of guilt and fear. "You want the truth?" he said, his voice strained. "Fine. I'm married, Vanessa. I have been this whole time." The words hit Vanessa like a physical blow. She stumbled back, gripping the edge of a chair for support. "Married?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. But you said—" "I know what I said," Richard cut her off, his tone harsh. "I lied, okay? I lied about everything. My wife, I married her for her family's money. I can't lose that, Vanessa. I won't." Vanessa felt as if she were drowning, struggling to breathe as the truth crashed over her. "You used me," she said, her voice breaking. "All this time, you were just using me." Richard ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in every movement. "It wasn't supposed to go this far. We were just having fun, weren't we? And on top of that, you are black. My family would never accept you. I never meant for this to happen." "This?" Vanessa repeated, her hand moving instinctively to her stomach. "This is our child, Richard. Our baby. How can you be so cold?" "I have a family to protect," Richard said, his voice hard. "A life I've built. I can't throw that all away for a mistake." Vanessa felt something snap inside her. "A mistake? Is that all I am to you? All we are?" She stepped forward, her eyes flashing with anger and hurt. "You have to take responsibility, Richard. You have to do the right thing. Leave your wife. Marry me. Be there for your child." Richard shook his head, backing away. "I can't do that, Vanessa. I won't. My wife, my family, they're my priority. I'm sorry, but that's just how it is." Vanessa felt the last of her hope crumble away. She sank to her knees, sobs racking her body. "How could you?" she cried. "How could you lie to me like this? I trusted you. I loved you." Richard stood there, watching her cry, his face a mask of discomfort and guilt. "I'm sorry, Vanessa. I truly am. But this is how it has to be." Vanessa looked up at him, her face streaked with tears. "I never want to see you again." Without another word, Richard grabbed his coat and left the office, the door closing behind him with a final sounding click. Vanessa sat there on the floor for what felt like hours, her mind reeling, her heart shattered. Finally, she pulled herself to her feet and made her way out of the building, each step feeling like it took all her strength. When she got home, her mother was waiting up for her, concern etched on her face. "Vanessa? Sweetheart, what's wrong?" The moment Vanessa saw her mother, the floodgates opened again. She collapsed into her mom's arms, sobbing out the whole story, the affair, the pregnancy, Richard's betrayal. Her mother held her close, stroking her hair and letting her cry. When Vanessa's sobs finally subsided, her mom gently tilted her chin up to meet her eyes. "Oh, my sweet girl," she said softly. "I'm so sorry you're going through this. What that man did to you was wrong, so very wrong." Vanessa sniffled, wiping at her eyes. "What am I going to do, Mom? I'm all alone. I'm going to have a baby, and I'm all alone." Her mother's eyes were filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. "You're not alone, sweetheart. You have me. We'll figure this out together." She paused, then continued, her voice gentle but firm. "But Vanessa, listen to me. Sometimes in life we have to take the high road even when others have wronged us terribly." Vanessa realized she had to fight. With shaking hands, Vanessa dialed Richard's office number the next day. Richard's voice came through the line, cold and annoyed. "What is it, Vanessa? I thought I made myself clear yesterday." Vanessa took a deep breath, steeling herself. "Richard, I can't let this go. If you won't take responsibility, I'll tell your wife everything. About us, about the baby. She deserves to know the truth." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Richard spoke again, his voice was low and dangerous. "You're making a big mistake, Vanessa. Come to my office, now." Heart pounding, Vanessa made her way to Richard's office. As she entered, she saw him standing by the window, his back to her. He turned slowly, his face a mask of barely controlled anger. "You think you can threaten me?" he asked, his voice eerily calm. Vanessa stood her ground. "It's not a threat, Richard. It's the truth. Your wife should know what kind of man she's married to." Richard's eyes narrowed. Let me make something very clear to you, Vanessa. I am a powerful man in this town. I have connections you can't even imagine." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Your mother? She lives alone, doesn't she? It would be a shame if something were to happen to her." Vanessa felt the blood drain from her face. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that if you breathe a word of this to anyone, especially my wife, your mother will suffer the consequences. Do you understand me?" Vanessa's legs felt weak. She gripped the back of a chair for support, her mind racing. Her mother was everything to her, the only family she had left. The thought of anything happening to her. You wouldn't," she whispered, but the cold look in Richard's eyes told her he absolutely would. "Try me," Richard said, his voice hard. "Now here's what's going to happen. You're fired, effective immediately. You will leave this office, and you will never show your face here again. You will not contact me, my family, or anyone associated with this company. Is that clear?" Tears welled up in Vanessa's eyes as the full weight of her situation crashed down on her. She was alone, pregnant, jobless, and now threatened. She had no choice. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Good," Richard said, turning back to the window. "Now get out of my sight." Vanessa stumbled out of the office, her world crumbling around her. She made it to her car before the sobs overtook her body shaking with the force of her despair. She was defeated, alone, with nowhere to turn. The days following her confrontation with Richard were a blur for Vanessa. She moved through her small rental apartment like a ghost, barely eating, hardly sleeping. Her mother's constant presence was the only thing keeping her tethered to reality. "You're strong, sweetheart," her mother would say, gently rubbing Vanessa's back. "We'll get through this together." As the weeks passed, Vanessa's belly began to swell. Despite the circumstances, a tiny spark of joy flickered in her heart every time she felt the baby move. Her mother was there for every doctor's appointment, every bout of morning sickness, every tearful breakdown. "This child is a blessing," her mother would remind her. "No matter what that man did, this baby is innocent and deserves all the love in the world." Vanessa nodded, trying to believe it. She threw herself into preparing for the baby's arrival, painting the spare room a soft yellow and filling it with second-hand furniture. But fate had one more cruel twist in store. On a chilly autumn morning, just as Vanessa entered her 7th month of pregnancy, her mother collapsed in the kitchen. Vanessa called for an ambulance, her hands shaking as she dialed. At the hospital, the doctors delivered the devastating news. Her mother had suffered a massive heart attack. There was nothing they could do. Vanessa sat by her mother's bedside, clutching her hand and sobbing. "Please don't leave me, Mom. I can't do this alone." The world seemed to lose all color after that. Vanessa moved through the following weeks in a daze, barely able to function. She went through the motions of planning the funeral, accepting casseroles from well-meaning neighbors and trying to prepare for the baby's arrival. But inside, she felt hollow. As her due date approached, Vanessa made a decision. She couldn't stay in this town, surrounded by memories and the constant fear of running into Richard. She needed a fresh start, somewhere far away where she could raise her child in peace. With trembling hands, she packed up her meager belongings and what was left of her savings. The night before she planned to leave, she stood in the nursery, running her hand over the crib her mother had helped her paint. "I'm sorry, Mom," she whispered. "I know you'd want me to be strong and stay, but I just can't. I hope you understand." The next morning, as dawn broke over the sleepy town, Vanessa loaded her old car and drove away without looking back. She had no real destination in mind, just a vague notion of heading west. As she crossed the state line, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to hope. 3 weeks later, in a small hospital in a town she'd never heard of before arriving, Vanessa gave birth to a beautiful baby boy. As she held him in her arms, marveling at his tiny fingers and button nose, she felt a surge of love so powerful it took her breath away. "Hello, Jaden," she whispered, the name she and her mother had chosen together. "It's just you and me now, little one, but we're going to be okay." Looking into Jaden's eyes, Vanessa made a solemn vow. She would never speak of Richard again. Her son would never know the pain of his father's rejection. Instead, she would fill his life with so much love that he would never feel the absence. Vanessa cradled Jaden in her arms, marveling at his tiny features. His soft, brown skin and wispy dark hair made her heart swell with love. She counted his fingers and toes, tears of joy streaming down her face. "Hello, my sweet boy," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "I'm your mama, and I love you more than anything in this world." Vanessa's mind drifted to Richard, despite her best efforts to push him from her thoughts. She wondered if Jaden had his eyes or his smile. The realization that she might see glimpses of Richard and their son brought a fresh wave of pain. "It doesn't matter," she said softly, more to herself than to Jaden. "You're all mine, and that's all that matters." A nurse came in to check on them, smiling warmly at the new mother and child. "He's beautiful," she said. "Do you have family coming to visit?" Vanessa's throat tightened. "No," she managed. "It's just us." The nurse's smile faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered. "Well, you two make quite the team already. I can see how much you love him." After the nurse left, Vanessa held Jaden close, inhaling his sweet baby scent. She thought about the long road ahead of them, the sleepless nights, the financial struggles, the challenges of being a single parent. It was overwhelming, but as she looked at her son's peaceful face, she felt a surge of determination. The next weeks slowly turned into years, and Vanessa began a lifelong journey of working hard and providing for her son in a harsh world. As her son grew up, she became even more attached to him. Jaden was all she had, despite going through some turbulent circumstances over the years, like when she got evicted from her house, or when she barely had any money to get herself treated. Not once did she think about contacting Richard for help. Her small boy soon turned 10 years old, and she continued to work hard to provide for him. Every morning, her alarm blared at 4:30 a.m., jolting her awake. She rubbed her tired eyes and forced herself out of bed. It was time to start another long day. She tiptoed into Jaden's room, smiling at her sleeping son. His dark hair was tousled, and his face peaceful. Vanessa gently kissed his forehead before heading to the kitchen. As she brewed coffee, Vanessa mentally ran through her packed schedule. First, her early shift at the diner. Then, a few hours at the local grocery store. Finally, evening babysitting for the neighbors. It was exhausting, but necessary to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table. By 7 a.m., Vanessa had Jaden up and ready for school. She packed his lunch, simple peanut butter sandwiches and an apple, wishing she could give him more. "Have a great day, sweetie," she said, hugging him tight. "I'll see you tonight." "Bye, Mom," Jaden replied, his smile brightening her day. As Vanessa rushed between jobs, her mind stayed on Jaden. She worried about him being alone after school, but they couldn't afford childcare. She'd taught him to lock the doors and not answer for strangers. Still, the guilt gnawed at her. That evening, Vanessa returned home bone-tired. She found Jaden at the kitchen table, homework spread out before him. "Hey, buddy," she said, dropping a kiss on his head. "How was your day?" Jaden looked up, his eyes shining. "Great! I got an A on my math test." Vanessa's heart swelled with pride. Despite their struggles, Jaden was thriving. "That's wonderful, I'm so proud of you." As they ate dinner, simple spaghetti Jaden had warmed up. Vanessa noticed her son seemed quieter than usual. "Everything okay?" she asked gently. Jaden hesitated, then asked softly, "Mom, why don't I have a dad like the other kids?" Vanessa's heart clenched. She'd known this question would come eventually, but it still hurt. She took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "Sweetie, families come in all shapes and sizes. Some kids have 2 parents, some have 1, some have grandparents or other guardians. What matters is that we love each other." Jaden nodded slowly. "But don't you get lonely sometimes?" Vanessa reached across the table, squeezing his hand. "How could I be lonely when I have you? You're all I need, Jaden. We're a team, you and me." A small smile tugged at Jaden's lips. "Yeah, we are." "That's right," Vanessa said, her voice growing stronger. We don't need anyone else. We've got each other, and that's more than enough. As they cleaned up dinner together, laughing over Jaden's jokes, Vanessa felt a warmth in her chest. Life wasn't easy, but moments like these made it all worthwhile. Later, as she tucked Jaden into bed, he hugged her tight. "I love you, Mom," he whispered. "I love you too, more than anything," Vanessa replied, her eyes misty. Sitting on the edge of his bed, Vanessa stroked Jaden's hair. Despite their financial struggles, the bond between them was unbreakable. She'd given up so much, worked so hard, but seeing Jaden's smile made it all worth it. As Jaden drifted off to sleep, Vanessa knew he still had questions about his father, but for now, he seemed content with their little family of two, and that was enough. Years passed, and Vanessa's hard work finally began to pay off. Her dedication and kind nature had caught the attention of her superiors at the grocery store, leading to a promotion to assistant manager.
The steady income apartment in a safer neighborhood, far cry from the cramped studio they'd called home for years.
Jaden, now 23, had grown into a thoughtful and curious young man. His intelligence shone through in his academic achievements, making Vanessa beam with pride. But as he matured, so did his questions about his past. One evening, as they sat at their small kitchen table eating dinner, Jaden pushed his food around his plate, his brow furrowed in thought. "Mom," he began hesitantly, "can I ask you something?" Vanessa looked up, sensing the seriousness in his tone. "Of course, honey. What's on your mind?" Jaden took a deep breath. "It's about my dad. I know you said he left before I was born, but why? Didn't he want me?" Vanessa's heart clenched. She'd known this day would come, but it didn't make it any easier. Setting down her fork, she reached across the table to take Jaden's hand. "Sweetie, it's complicated," she said softly. "Your father, he made some choices that hurt us both. But that doesn't mean he didn't want you. Sometimes adults make mistakes." Jaden's eyes searched her face. "But what kind of mistakes? Why did he leave? What was his name? Do I look like him?" The questions tumbled out, each one feeling like a dagger to Vanessa's heart. She closed her eyes briefly, fighting back the flood of painful memories. "Jaden," she said, her voice strained, "I know you have a lot of questions, but talking about your father, it's very difficult for me. He left us, and that's all you need to know right now." Jaden pulled his hand away, frustration clear on his face. "But that's not fair. I have a right to know about him. He's part of who I am." Vanessa felt tears pricking at her eyes. "I understand you're curious, but please try to understand. This isn't easy for me. Your father isn't in our lives, and that's not going to change. We have each other, and that's what matters." "But Mom?" Jaden started to protest. "No more questions," Vanessa said firmly, though her voice shook slightly. "I've told you what you need to know. He left before you were born, and that's all there is to it." Jaden slumped in his chair, clearly unsatisfied with the vague answers. He opened his mouth as if to argue further, but something in Vanessa's expression made him stop. Instead, he nodded silently and returned to picking at his food. Vanessa watched him, her heart heavy. She knew her son deserved more answers, but the thought of delving into that painful past was too much to bear. Later that night, Jaden threw himself into his studies with a passion that both impressed and worried Vanessa. She'd often find him hunched over his textbooks late into the night, his desk lamp casting a soft glow across his furrowed brow. "Honey, don't you think it's time for bed?" Vanessa would ask, leaning against his doorframe. Jaden would look up, offering a tired smile. "Just a little longer, Mom. I want to make sure I'm ready for the test tomorrow." Vanessa's chest would swell with pride, even as a twinge of concern nagged at her. She knew he was pushing himself hard, driven by a desire to secure a better future for them both. At school, Jaden's teachers praised his work ethic and intelligence. He excelled in his classes, particularly in math and science. His guidance counselor had started mentioning words like scholarships and top universities, possibilities that both thrilled and terrified Vanessa. But it wasn't just his academic achievements that made Jaden special. He'd taken on more and more responsibility at home, too. He insisted on helping with the grocery shopping, often comparing prices and clipping coupons to stretch their budget. On weekends, he'd tackle household chores without being asked, determined to lighten his mother's load. What Jayden didn't realize was just how much Vanessa needed that help. Over the past few months, she'd noticed her energy levels dropping. Simple tasks like climbing the stairs to their apartment left her winded. There were days when the bone-deep fatigue made it hard to get out of bed. Vanessa tried to hide these symptoms from Jayden, not wanting to worry him, but she couldn't hide the pallor of her skin or the dark circles under her eyes. She caught Jayden watching her sometimes, concern etched across his young face. One evening, as Vanessa stirred a pot of soup on the stove, a wave of dizziness washed over her. She gripped the counter, closing her eyes until the world stopped spinning. "Mom?" Jayden's voice came from behind her, laced with worry. "Are you okay?" Vanessa forced a smile, turning to face him. "Of course, sweetie. Just a little tired, that's all." Jayden's eyes narrowed, unconvinced. "You've been tired a lot lately. Maybe you should see a doctor." "Oh, there's no need for that," Vanessa said, waving off his concern. "I'm fine, really. Now why don't you set the table? Dinner's almost ready." Jayden hesitated, clearly wanting to press the issue. But after a moment, he nodded and moved to get the plates. Vanessa watched him, her heart heavy with the weight of her secrets. As much as she tried to convince herself otherwise, Vanessa knew something was wrong. The fatigue, the dizziness, the persistent ache in her bones. They were all signs she couldn't ignore forever. But the thought of worrying Jayden, of burdening him with her health concerns on top of everything else, was unbearable. And then there was the other secret, the one she'd carried for so long, the truth about Jayden's father. As her son grew older, the questions in his eyes became harder to avoid. She saw the way he would sometimes stare at his reflection, searching for clues about the man who had helped create him. Vanessa knew she should tell him the truth. Jayden deserved to know where he came from, even if that truth was painful. But every time she thought about opening up, about revisiting that dark chapter of her life, fear gripped her heart. One weekend, Vanessa woke up early, made breakfast for Jayden, and headed to her job at the local diner. She ignored the dull ache in her bones and the exhaustion that seemed to weigh her down more with each passing day. At the diner, Vanessa moved between tables, her smile never faltering despite her fatigue. As she reached for a coffee pot, a wave of dizziness washed over her. The world tilted, and suddenly the floor was rushing up to meet her. "Vanessa!" her co-worker shouted as she crumpled to the ground. Everything after that was a blur of sirens, bright lights, and concerned faces. When Vanessa finally regained full consciousness, she found herself in a hospital bed, with a tearful Jayden clutching her hand. "Mom," he choked out, his voice thick with emotion. "Why didn't you tell me?" Before Vanessa could respond, a doctor entered the room. His face was grave as he delivered the news that would change their lives forever. "I'm sorry, Ms. Thompson," he said softly. "The tests show that you have stage 2 cancer. It's quite severe." The words hit Jayden like a physical blow. He stared at the doctor in disbelief, then back at his mother. Vanessa's face had gone pale, but there was a resigned look in her eyes that told Jayden she'd suspected something was wrong for a while. What does this mean?" Jayden asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The doctor explained the situation in gentle terms. The cancer had spread, making treatment difficult. They would do what they could, but the prognosis wasn't good. As the doctor spoke, Jayden's mind raced. He thought about the long hours his mother had worked, the sacrifices she'd made. How could this be happening to her? It wasn't fair. In the days that followed, Jayden threw himself into action. He took time off from his studies to be with Vanessa during her initial treatments. He researched her condition obsessively, looking for any glimmer of hope. But hope, Jayden quickly learned, came with a hefty price tag. The treatments Vanessa needed were expensive, far beyond what their insurance would cover. Jayden watched helplessly as the medical bills piled up, each one a reminder of how ill-equipped they were to handle this crisis. Determined to do something, anything, Jayden took on more work. He picked up extra shifts at the campus bookstore where he worked part-time. On weekends, he started doing odd jobs around the neighborhood, mowing lawns, painting fences, whatever he could find. Every dollar he earned went towards his mother's care, but it never seemed to be enough. The treatments drained Vanessa's energy, leaving her weak and pale. Yet she still tried to put on a brave face for Jayden, insisting she was fine even when it was clear she was struggling. As weeks turned into months, Jayden watched his mother's condition deteriorate. The realization that he might lose her, the only parent he'd ever known, filled him with a desperate determination. One day, Jayden hurried down the bustling city sidewalk, his mind preoccupied with thoughts of his mother. He clutched a paper bag containing her favorite soup from the deli near their apartment. It wasn't much, but he hoped it might bring a smile to her face. As he rounded the corner, his shoulder collided with someone. "Sorry," Jayden mumbled, looking up to see a well-dressed man in his 50s. "No harm done," the man replied, barely glancing at Jayden as he straightened his expensive suit. They both continued on their way, unaware of the connection that bound them. Jayden quickened his pace, eager to reach the hospital before visiting hours ended. At the hospital entrance, Jayden noticed the same man from earlier. He was speaking to the receptionist, his voice low and urgent. Jayden thought nothing of it as he made his way to his mother's room. "Hey, Mom," Jayden said softly as he entered. Vanessa lay in bed looking small and fragile against the stark white sheets. Her face lit up at the sight of her son. "Jayden," she smiled weakly, "you didn't have to come again today." "Of course I did," he replied, setting the soup on her bedside table. "I brought your favorite." As they chatted, neither noticed the figure that appeared in the doorway. Richard stood frozen, his eyes wide with shock as he recognized Vanessa. His gaze darted between her and Jayden, realization dawning on his face. Vanessa looked up, sensing someone's presence. Her eyes met Richard's, and the color drained from her face. "Richard?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jayden turned, confused by his mother's reaction, but before he could say anything, Richard spun on his heel and fled down the hallway. "Wait!" Jayden called out, but the man was already gone. He turned back to his mother, questions forming on his lips. "Mom, who was that? Did you know him?" Vanessa's eyes were filled with a mixture of pain and fear. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Jayden sat by his mother's hospital bed, his mind racing with questions. The strange man's reaction and his mother's whispered recognition had stirred up a storm of emotions inside him. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the conversation he knew they needed to have. "Mom," he began gently, "who was that man? Why did he run away when he saw you?" Vanessa's eyes filled with tears. She looked away, her hands twisting the thin hospital blanket. "Jayden, I never wanted you to find out like this." "Find out what?" Jayden pressed, his heart pounding. Vanessa took a shaky breath. "That man, his name is Richard, he's your father." The words hit Jayden like a punch to the gut. He stared at his mother in disbelief. "My father? But you always said—" "I know, sweetheart. I'm so sorry." Vanessa's voice cracked. "I thought I was protecting you by not telling you the truth." Jayden's mind whirled as he tried to process this revelation. Why didn't he want me? Why did he leave us? Vanessa's face crumpled with pain. She began to tell Jayden the story she had kept hidden for so long, her relationship with Richard, the pregnancy, and his cruel rejection. As Vanessa spoke, Jayden's shock gave way to a burning anger. His fists clenched at his sides, his jaw tight with fury. He abandoned us? Just like that? And now he's some rich CEO? Vanessa nodded sadly. "I'm so sorry, Jayden. I never wanted you to feel this pain." Jayden stood up abruptly, pacing the small hospital room. "All these years we've struggled. You've worked so hard, sacrificed so much, and he's been living it up, not caring about us at all?" "Jayden, please," Vanessa pleaded. "What's done is done. We can't change the past." But Jayden wasn't listening. His mind was racing with possibilities. "He owes us, Mom. He owes you for all the pain he caused. Maybe now we can finally get you the treatment you need." Vanessa's eyes widened with alarm. No, Jaden, you can't confront him. Please, just let it go. Jaden turned to his mother, his eyes blazing with determination. I can't let it go, Mom. He needs to face what he did. He needs to take responsibility. Jaden, listen to me, Vanessa begged. Nothing good can come from digging up the past. We've managed on our own all these years. We don't need him now. But Jaden's resolve was set. He leaned down and kissed his mother's forehead. I'm going to make this right, Mom. I promise. He won't get away with what he did to us. Jaden went home after his mother was asleep and started going through her old pictures, hoping to find some clue about the man he saw. Then, he found an old picture. It was the only tangible link he had to Richard, a snapshot of a younger Vanessa, smiling and carefree, with a handsome man's arm around her shoulders. Jaden's eyes narrowed as he studied Richard's face, searching for any resemblance to his own features. With a determined sigh, Jaden opened his laptop and began his research. He spent hours scouring the internet for information about Richard Brooks, CEO of a successful tech company. News articles, press releases, and social media posts painted a picture of a wealthy, respected businessman. The contrast between Richard's lavish lifestyle and the struggles Jaden and Vanessa had endured made his blood boil. As the days passed, Jaden's obsession grew. He printed out articles and photos, creating a makeshift evidence board on his bedroom wall. He jotted down notes, trying to piece together a timeline of Richard's life. But hard evidence of his connection to Richard remained frustratingly elusive. Jaden knew he needed more than just an old photograph to prove his case. He considered hiring a private investigator, but quickly dismissed the idea. They couldn't afford it, and time was running out. His mother's condition was worsening, and the expensive treatments she needed were far beyond their means. One sleepless night, as Jaden paced his small room, his eyes fell on the photograph once more. A realization struck him. He didn't need ironclad proof. He had his mother's story, his own existence, and the unmistakable fear in Richard's eyes when he'd seen Vanessa at the hospital. It would have to be enough. With renewed determination, Jaden formulated a plan. He would confront Richard directly, face to face. The thought made his palms sweat and his heart race, but he pushed aside his fear. Jaden spent the next day preparing. He rehearsed what he would say, trying to anticipate Richard's reactions. He put on his best clothes, a slightly wrinkled button-down shirt, and the only pair of dress pants he owned. As he knotted his tie with shaking hands, he caught his reflection in the mirror. For a moment, he saw a glimpse of the man in the photograph staring back at him. Taking a deep breath, Jaden tucked the old photograph into his pocket and headed out. He'd found the address of Richard's company headquarters online, a gleaming skyscraper in the heart of another city's business district. As he rode the bus across state, Jaden's resolve strengthened. He thought of his mother lying in the hospital, of all the birthdays and holidays they'd scraped by, of the constant worry about money that had shadowed their lives. Finally, Jaden stood before the imposing glass building. He squared his shoulders and walked through the revolving door, his heart pounding. The pristine lobby was a world away from anything he'd ever known. Marble floors gleamed beneath his feet, and well-dressed people hurried past him. Jaden approached the reception desk, mustering all his courage. "I'm here to see Richard Brooks," he said, proud that his voice didn't shake. "It's urgent." The receptionist looked at him skeptically. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but..." "I'm sorry, sir, Mr. Brooks is very busy. You'll need to schedule an appointment." Jaden leaned forward, his voice low and intense. "Please, tell him it's about Vanessa. He'll want to see me." The receptionist hesitated, then picked up the phone. Jaden held his breath as she spoke quietly into the receiver. After what felt like an eternity, she hung up and looked at him with surprise. "Take the elevator to the top floor," she said, handing him a visitor's badge. "Mr. Brooks will see you now." As Jaden stepped into the elevator, his heart raced. This was it. He was about to come face to face with the man who had abandoned him and his mother. The elevator doors slid open, revealing a luxurious executive suite. Jaden stepped out, ready to confront his father and change their lives forever. Jaden marched him into a spacious office, slamming the door behind them. "What do you think you're doing?" Richard snarled, his calm facade crumbling. "You can't just barge in here. Who the hell are you?" Jaden stood tall, unflinching. "Vanessa is dying and you owe us. You need to pay for her treatment. She told me everything." Richard's face twisted with anger. "I don't owe you anything. There's no proof we're related. Do you think you're the first person to try and extort money from me?" "Extort?" Jaden's voice rose. "I'm asking you to take responsibility for once in your life, to help the woman you left alone and pregnant." Richard scoffed, regaining his arrogant composure. "Listen, kid, even if what you're saying is true, and I'm not admitting it is, a single confrontation like this wouldn't hold up in court. You have no evidence, no legal standing. It's your word against mine. Never come back here again." Jaden stumbled out of Richard's office, his face flushed with anger and frustration. The security guards escorted him to the lobby, their firm grip on his arms a stark reminder of how powerless he felt. As the glass doors closed behind him, Jaden took a deep breath of the city air, trying to calm his racing heart. "This isn't over," he muttered to himself, clenching his fists. The determination that had brought him this far refused to let him give up now. His mother's face, pale and drawn from her illness, flashed in his mind. He wouldn't, let her down. Jaden walked aimlessly for a while, his mind churning with possibilities. He needed proof, something concrete that would force Richard to acknowledge him. Suddenly, an idea struck him. DNA evidence. It was a long shot, but it might be his only chance. With renewed purpose, Jaden searched for a cheap motel. He found one a few blocks away, a dingy place with flickering neon signs. The room was small and musty, but it would do for the night. Jaden sat on the creaky bed, pulling out his phone to call his mom. "Hey, Mom," he said softly when Vanessa answered. "How are you feeling?" "I'm okay, sweetheart," Vanessa replied, her voice weak but warm. "Where are you? I've been worried." Jaden hesitated, not wanting to burden her with his plans. "I'm still in the city, just taking care of some things." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Jaden," Vanessa said slowly, "you didn't go see Richard, did you?" He sighed, knowing he couldn't lie to her. "I did, Mom, I had to try." "Oh, honey," Vanessa's voice cracked. "I told you to leave it alone. Whatever happened between Richard and me, it's in the past. You need to forgive him and move on." Jaden felt a surge of frustration. "How can I forgive him when he won't even admit what he did? He abandoned us, Mom. He left you alone and sick. I can't just let that go." "Holding on to anger only hurts you, Jaden," Vanessa pleaded. "Please come home. We'll figure something out together." "I will soon, Mom, I promise," Jaden said, his resolve strengthening. "I love you. Get some rest, okay?" After hanging up, Jaden spent a restless night planning his next move. When morning came, he checked out of the motel and made his way back to Richard's office building. This time, he didn't go inside. Instead, he found a secluded spot across the street where he could watch the entrance without being seen. Hours passed. Jaden's legs cramped from standing still for so long, but he refused to move. Finally, in the early afternoon, he saw Richard emerge from the building. Jaden's heart raced as he carefully followed at a distance. Richard walked briskly, seemingly oblivious to being tailed. He entered a sleek restaurant, the kind of place Jaden could never afford. Jaden waited outside, peering through the large windows. He watched as Richard was seated at a table, ordered a coffee, and began looking through some papers. Time crawled by. Jaden's stomach growled, reminding him he hadn't eaten all day. Just as he was considering giving up, he saw Richard stand and head towards the restroom. This was his chance. Jaden slipped into the restaurant, ignoring the hostess's questioning look. He made a beeline for Richard's table, his eyes fixed on the half-empty coffee cup. With a quick glance around to make sure no one was watching, he snatched the cup and hurried out of the restaurant. His heart pounding, Jaden clutched the cup to his chest as he speed-walked away from the scene. He had done it. He had the DNA sample he needed. Now, all he had to do was find a way to get it tested. He headed to a lab and gave the samples for testing. The waiting time was 3 days. For 2 agonizing days, Jaden paced his small motel room, his mind racing with possibilities. The DNA test results seemed to take forever. He barely slept, his thoughts consumed by what the outcome might mean for his mother's treatment. Finally, on the morning of the third day, his phone buzzed with an email notification. Jaden's hands shook as he opened it, his heart pounding in his chest. As he read the results, a mix of emotions washed over him: relief, vindication, and a renewed sense of anger towards Richard. The test confirmed it. Richard was his biological father. There was no denying it now. Jaden sat on the edge of the bed, letting the reality sink in. He had known it all along, of course, but seeing it in black and white made it feel more real. This was the proof he needed to confront Richard once and for all. Taking a deep breath, Jaden picked up his phone and dialed Richard's office number. His palms were sweaty as he waited for someone to answer. "Richard Brooks's office," a crisp voice answered. "I need to speak with Mr. Brooks," Jaden said, trying to keep his voice steady. "It's urgent." There was a pause, then, "May I ask who's calling?" "Tell him it's Jaden. He'll know who I am." After a few moments of silence, Richard's voice came through the line, sounding annoyed. "What do you want? I thought I made myself clear last time." Jaden's grip on the phone tightened. "Things have changed, Richard. I have proof that you're my father." "What are you talking about?" Richard scoffed, but Jaden detected a hint of unease in his voice. "I have the results of a DNA test," Jaden said firmly. "It proves you're my biological father, and if you don't help pay for my mother's cancer treatment, I'll make sure everyone knows about it. Your wife, your business partners, everyone." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Richard spoke again, his voice was low and controlled. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Jaden challenged. "Are you willing to take that risk? Because I'm not bluffing, Richard. I'll expose you if I have to. All I want is for my mother to get the treatment she needs." Another pause. Jaden could almost hear the gears turning in Richard's head. "Fine," Richard finally said. "Let's meet tomorrow. We can discuss this situation." "Okay," Jaden agreed, his heart racing with a mix of anticipation and dread. "Where and when?" "I will tell you that in the evening," Richard murmured, hanging up the phone quickly, as if he had talked to a ghost. After the call, Richard paced his luxurious office, his mind racing with panic. The carefully constructed facade of his life was on the verge of crumbling. He picked up his phone with trembling hands and dialed his lawyer's number. "John, I need to see you immediately. It's an emergency," Richard said, his voice strained. An hour later, Richard sat across from his lawyer in a private meeting room. He explained the situation, his words tumbling out in a rush. John listened carefully, his brow furrowed. When Richard finished, the lawyer leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Richard, this is serious. If this young man goes public with the DNA evidence, you stand to lose everything." "What do you mean, everything?" Richard asked, his face pale. "Your prenuptial agreement with your wife is very clear," John explained. "In the event of infidelity, she's entitled to almost all of your assets, not to mention the damage to your reputation and business relationships." Richard felt the blood drain from his face. "There has to be something we can do." John shook his head. "Legally, our options are limited. Your best bet is to negotiate with Jaden privately. Try to reach an agreement that satisfies him without exposing your secret." Richard nodded slowly, his mind already working on a plan. "I'll set up a meeting with him, somewhere discreet." As he left the lawyer's office, Richard's fear began to give way to determination. He couldn't let this ruin everything he'd worked for. He'd find a way to keep Jaden quiet, no matter what it took. Back in his office, Richard called Jaden. "There's a small cafe on the outskirts of town. It's quiet, away from prying eyes. We can talk there." Jaden agreed, and they set a time. As Richard hung up, he felt a mix of dread and resolve. He had to find a way to contain this situation to protect his wealth and his reputation. Tomorrow's meeting will determine everything. The next day, Richard and Jaden met at the decided venue. The coffee shop buzzed with quiet chatter as Jaden sat at a corner table, his hands clasped tightly around a steaming mug. Richard spotted Jaden and made his way over, his face a mask of cool indifference. "Well, here I am," he said, sliding into the seat across from Jaden. Let's get this over with. Jaden took a deep breath, steadying himself. Thank you for coming, he said, his voice low but firm. I have something you need to see. He reached into his bag and pulled out a manila envelope. With steady hands, he slid it across the table to Richard. These are the DNA test results, Jaden explained. They prove that you're my father. Richard's eyes widened slightly, but he quickly regained his composure. He opened the envelope and scanned the contents, his brow furrowing as he read. The color drained from his face as the truth sank in. This can't be right, Richard muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. It is right. You can drop your act now, Jaden said firmly. You can't deny it anymore. I'm your son, and my mother needs your help. Richard set the papers down, his hands shaking slightly. He looked at Jaden, really looked at him for the first time. The resemblance was undeniable now that he allowed himself to see it. What do you want from me? Richard asked, his voice barely above a whisper. My mother has cancer, Jaden explained, his voice catching. She needs expensive treatment that we can't afford. I'm asking you to pay for it. It's the least you can do after abandoning us. Richard was quiet for a long moment, his mind clearly racing. Finally, he spoke. All right, he said, his voice heavy. I'll pay for the treatment. But that's it. I won't publicly acknowledge you. My life, my family. I can't risk losing everything. Jaden felt a mix of relief and anger wash over him. So you'll throw money at the problem and hope it goes away? He asked bitterly. Richard's jaw tightened. It's more than most people in my position would do, he said defensively. Take it or leave it. Jaden closed his eyes, thinking of his mother lying in the hospital bed. He knew he had to swallow his pride for her sake. Fine, he said at last. I'll take it. But don't think this makes everything okay between us. Richard nodded, already reaching for his checkbook. I understand, he said, not meeting Jaden's eyes. I'll have my lawyer draw up the paperwork for the medical payments. You'll have it by tomorrow. As Richard scribbled out a check, Jaden watched him, a mix of emotions swirling in his chest. He had won the battle for his mother's treatment, but at what cost? The father he had imagined all these years was nothing like the man sitting before him. He then went back to his hometown. With Richard's financial support secured, Vanessa began receiving the proper cancer treatment she desperately needed. The sterile hospital rooms became a second home as she underwent chemotherapy and various other procedures. Jaden spent every moment he could by her side, holding her hand through the tough days and celebrating the small victories. As the weeks turned into months, Vanessa's condition slowly improved. The doctors spoke of hope, of the cancer retreating, and Jaden felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. He watched his mother's strength return bit by bit, her smile growing brighter with each passing day. Every month, like clockwork, Richard's money arrived. It covered all the medical expenses, and even left enough for Jaden to take some time off work to care for his mother. But the regular payments were a constant reminder of the complicated situation they found themselves in. Jaden couldn't help but feel a mix of gratitude and bitterness each time he saw the check arrive. On one hand, the money was saving his mother's life. On the other, he knew Richard's motives weren't pure. The payments were born out of fear, not remorse or a genuine desire to make amends. One evening, as Jaden sat by Vanessa's hospital bed, she reached out and squeezed his hand. You look troubled, sweetheart, she said softly. What's on your mind? Jaden sighed, running his free hand through his hair. I don't know how to feel about all this, Mom. The money from Richard, it's helping you get better, and I'm so grateful for that. But knowing why he's really doing it, it doesn't sit right with me. Vanessa nodded, understanding in her eyes. I know it's complicated, Jaden, but sometimes we have to accept help, even if it comes from an imperfect source. But is it enough? Jaden asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Does it make up for all those years he wasn't there, for leaving us to struggle on our own? The question hung in the air between them. Jaden felt torn, caught between his desire to see his mother healthy and his resentment towards the man who had abandoned them. The money was making a difference. There was no denying that, but it couldn't erase the past or fill the void left by years without a father. As Jaden sat there holding his mother's hand, he wondered if he had made the right choice in accepting Richard's help. The money was saving his mother's life, but at what cost to his own peace of mind? He couldn't shake the feeling that by taking the money, he was somehow letting Richard off the hook for his past actions. Vanessa had been receiving the cancer treatment she needed for months, thanks to Richard's financial support. With the proper care, her health gradually improved, and she was finally discharged from the hospital. Her body was still weak, but the doctors assured Jaden that with time and the right follow-up care, she would be fine. Jaden was relieved. His mother, the person he loved most in the world, was going to live. But despite Vanessa's recovery, Jaden couldn't shake the anger he felt. Richard, his biological father, had caused so much pain. For years, he had abandoned them, leaving Vanessa to struggle as a single mother while he lived a life of luxury. Even when Jaden had finally confronted Richard, the man had only helped out of fear, not remorse. Richard had never truly cared about them, and now that his mother was getting better, Jaden realized something. He didn't need Richard's money anymore, but that didn't mean he was going to let Richard off the hook. No, Richard had ruined Vanessa's life once, and now it was Jaden's turn to make sure Richard faced the consequences. One day, while Vanessa was resting, Jaden made a decision. He was going to destroy Richard's life, just as Richard had destroyed theirs. And he had a plan. Jaden had spent days preparing. He told his mother that he will be gone for a trip, after which he went down to the city again, the same city where his father lived. After a few days of following Richard around and seeing where he goes, Jaden now knew where he lived. One evening, he saw her wife entering the house along with Richard's happy children. This life could have been mine if only. Never mind, I will do everything on my own. I don't need another man's charity. I will do what I came here to do, said Jaden. The house was grand, much larger than anything Jaden or Vanessa had ever known. Jaden clenched his fists, thinking of all the years they had struggled while Richard lived in such wealth. He reached the front door and carefully placed an envelope under the mat, making sure it was easy to spot. The note inside was simple but powerful. It read, "Your husband has another son." Jaden didn't wait around. He slipped away from the property and headed back home, his heart pounding with a mix of excitement and nerves. His plan was to eventually tear their family apart, but to his surprise, Richard happened to open the door and pick up the note. The next day, Jaden's phone rang. It was Richard. Jaden could hear the anger in his voice. "What is this?" Richard growled. "You think you can blackmail me?" Jaden didn't flinch. "I'm just giving you a taste of what you did to my mom all those years ago," he replied calmly. "You threatened her, you ruined her life. Now it's your turn." There was silence on the other end of the line. Jaden knew Richard was processing the fact that things were out of his control. "What do you want, Jaden?" Richard finally asked, his voice quieter but no less angry. "I want you to pay," Jaden said. "Not with money. This time, I want you to suffer the way we did. And if you don't do exactly as I say, I'll make sure your wife knows everything." "I'll tell her the truth," Richard threatened. "She won't believe a word you say." Jaden smirked. "She'll believe me, especially when I show her the DNA test and tell her about how you paid for my mom's cancer treatment. She'll believe every word." Jaden hung up before Richard could say anything more. Richard thought that he could shut them off by paying money, but he did not realize that doing this would leave a paper trail behind, another piece of evidence that could be used against him. After the call from Jaden, Richard felt a wave of panic wash over him. He spent the next hour pacing his house, trying to figure out how to keep everything from unraveling. He had to get his wife out of the house, fast. He couldn't let Jaden get anywhere near her. Richard put on a smile, walked into the living room, and suggested they take an abrupt vacation. "You've been working so hard lately, my love," he said, his voice smooth. "How about we take a trip, just the two of us right now? We can leave tonight." His wife, usually charmed by his suggestions, looked at him strangely. "Why are you acting so weird?" she asked, her eyes narrowing. "What's going on?" Richard's smile faltered. Weird? I'm not acting weird. I just thought you could use a break. Somewhere relaxing, you know. She crossed her arms, her suspicion growing. Richard, you never suggest last-minute vacations. Why are your hands trembling? What are you hiding? Before Richard could answer, the doorbell rang. His heart skipped a beat and his face paled. I'll get it, he said quickly, rushing toward the door. He pulled it open just enough to see Jaden standing on the porch. But before Jaden could say a word, Richard slammed the door shut. His wife, still standing in the living room, called out, "Who was that?" Richard turned around, forcing a smile. No one, just a delivery person. But then the doorbell rang again. This time his wife was closer. She shot Richard a curious look before moving past him to open the door herself. Richard grabbed her arm, trying to stop her. Don't. But it was too late. She opened the door, and there stood Jaden. Jaden's eyes locked with hers, and in that moment, everything began to unravel. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but guarded. Jaden nodded. "I think you'll want to hear what I have to say." At first, she looked skeptical, but something in Jaden's eyes made her step aside and let him in. Jaden took a deep breath. This was it. He was about to reveal everything. They sat in the living room and Jaden began to speak. "My name is Jaden. I'm Richard's son, his illegitimate son." He paused to gauge her reaction. She looked stunned, but she didn't interrupt, so he continued. 24 years ago, Richard had an affair with my mother, Vanessa. When she told him she was pregnant, he abandoned us, fired her from her job, threatened her, and left her to raise me alone. We've struggled our whole lives because of him. Richard's wife's face went pale. Jaden reached into his backpack and pulled out the DNA test results, handing them to her. "This proves I'm his son," he said. "And if that's not enough, I can tell you how Richard has been secretly paying for my mother's cancer treatment for the past few months." She stared at the paper in her hands, her eyes wide. I had no idea," she whispered. Jaden nodded. "I didn't either, for a long time. But now you know the truth, and I'm telling you because you deserve to know who your husband really is." Richard stood there, shocked and flushed. For a long moment, there was silence. Then Richard's wife stood up, her face hardening. "Thank you for telling me," she said quietly. "I'll take it from here." Jaden saw the look in her eyes and knew his job was done. He boarded the next bus and went back to his town, feeling triumphant. Over in Richard's house, the problems had just began. "I can explain," Richard began, but his wife cut him off. "Don't bother," she said coldly. Richard felt a wave of panic rise in his chest. "Please, listen to me." "No," she snapped. "I've listened to enough of your lies. We're done. I want a divorce." The word hit Richard like a punch to the gut. "A divorce?" he echoed, his voice weak. "Yes," she said, standing up. "And just so you know, once this divorce is finalized, I'm going to make sure you don't see a penny of my family's wealth. You'll be lucky if you leave with anything at all." Richard's world came crashing down around him. Everything he had built, everything he had worked for, was about to disappear. It didn't take long for the news to spread. Within weeks, Richard had lost everything. His marriage, his business connections, his reputation, it was all gone. His wife had left him, taking most of the wealth with her. He was left with nothing but the guilt of his past mistakes. One day, Richard found himself standing outside Vanessa's small apartment. He hesitated, wondering if he should even be there, but he had to try. He knocked on the door, and after a few moments, Vanessa answered. She looked at him, surprised but not entirely shocked. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice cold. Richard swallowed hard. "I came to apologize," he said. "For everything. I've lost everything, Vanessa. My wife, my money, my business. It's all gone. I realize now how much I hurt you, how much I hurt Jaden. I'm sorry." Vanessa stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she spoke. "You're sorry?" she repeated. "Do you think that makes up for what you did to me? To us? You abandoned us, Richard. You ruined my life. Sorry doesn't change that. Richard nodded, his shoulders slumping. I know. I just needed you to know that I regret it. Vanessa shook her head. Regret doesn't erase the past. I'll never forget what you did to me. Never. Richard felt a lump rise in his throat. He had hoped for forgiveness, but deep down, he knew he didn't deserve it. I understand, he said quietly. I'm sorry. Without another word, Vanessa closed the door, leaving Richard standing alone in the hallway. He turned and walked away, knowing that he had lost everything that mattered. As for Jaden, life was finally starting to look up. Shortly after Richard's downfall, Jaden received some good news of his own. He had been awarded a full merit scholarship to the state college, along with a stipend that would allow him to support his mother while he studied. It was everything he had dreamed of, and more. Vanessa was overjoyed when Jaden told her the news. I'm so proud of you, she said, hugging him tightly. You've worked so hard for this. Jaden smiled. I couldn't have done it without you, Mom. Together, Jaden and Vanessa moved forward, leaving the pain of the past behind. They had each other, and that was all they needed. If you enjoyed the story of Jaden, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.